Hello, this is Dean Radin, and I'm on Your Superior Self.
Hi, I'm Anita Murjani, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hello, this is Dr. Raymond Moody, and this is Your Superior Self.
Hi, Cultural Creatives. I'm Bruce Lipton, and I'm here to join you with Your Superior Self.
This is Paul Selig, and this is Your Superior Self.
What's up, everybody? I'm Aubrey Marcus, and this is Your Superior Self.
Welcome back, Stephen Kotler, author of The Devil's Dictionary, a novel sequel to Last Tango in Cyberspace. Stephen, Cotty, thank you for taking the time, my man.
Trey, it's really good to see you.
I'm loving this book. I'm digging it. The detail is insane, but there's a lot of similarities that I'm starting to pick up between the protagonist, Lion Zord, and you, my man. Lion wears a lot of black, and he likes to roll his own cigarettes. Are you the inspiration behind the character?
I will definitely tell you that I wrote fiction a long time ago, right? I was trained as a novelist and wrote a bunch of early books and tried to write as far away from myself as I possibly could. I thought that was the point of fiction, like create a world, create characters very different from yourself. And the emotions were never right. The characters were never, it wasn't quite right. And so this time, yeah, Lion's a little closer to me than other characters have been. I think there are some pretty big differences, but yeah, there's some similarities, I think.
It's funny. Every time he talks, like I hear your voice. It's funny. And then Sue Jackson's in this too.
Sue Jackson gets a shout out. Yes, she does.
Susan Jackson, the flow psychologist from down under Australia. I'm wondering though, who's Rian? Who's Rian Dorse? Is he Buddy Holly or Five Spikes?
Yeah, I don't think Rian. I'm not putting. It's a bad idea to put the CEO of your company into your books. Did you learn anything watching Woody Allen movies?
So tell me, what's the story behind the story with The Devil's Dictionary?
Yeah, it's a great question. For me, it was a couple of things. First and foremost, our planet is facing some pretty heavy environmental challenges: climate change, species die-off, water scarcity, and so forth. And there's a ton of books out there right now, sci-fi, cli-fi, and whatever. They're all doomsday scenarios about the future. And all my work on peak performance, all my work in neuroscience, psychology, et cetera, tells me that if you can't imagine a better world, you cannot create that world. So I started saying, okay, let's create a world 15 years in the future where the major environmental challenges had been solved. I didn't want to create like a perfect utopia because I knew that solving those challenges was going to create other challenges, right? And it was going to keep on rolling. And I wanted to address that clearly, but I really wanted to say, okay, what has to be different? And it wasn't just technological solutions. I was really interested in personal, like what had to change in us as a species, as humans, like how we feel about the natural world, how we see and care about plants and animals and ecosystems and all this stuff. And I really was focused on what is that shift and what that is that going to take. And of course, because I've written 6 books on technology, there's a whole bunch of kind of whiz bang technology, because I took all this stuff that we've been writing about present tense and rolled it 15 years into the future and said, okay, this is, I think, where it's going to be, and this is the world.
Yeah, I think the technology is amazing. I guess you got all your research. I mean, you did the research, so you're just pulling from that research when you're talking about the gadgets, like the VR goggles.
Funny story. So my last big book on technology was The Future is Faster Than You Think, wrote Peter Diamandis. And Peter and I people, like, I never call myself a futurist. I don't, like, there are people who do that, who can kind of look into the future and say, okay, I think the world is going to, I don't try to play that kind of prognosticator, but we were doing these like snippets of futurism in Faster where I had to do it. It's 2035 and you walk into your kitchen. I was like, oh crap, I got to figure this out. And because Faster is about 15 different lines of accelerating technology coming together and converging, and what happens when AI meets robotics, meets nanotechnology, et cetera. I was having a really hard time figuring it out and solving for these writing challenges. And I didn't want to get it wrong. So I stopped and I literally created a world where these technologies all existed. And then I put characters in it and used it to tell a story. And that was Last Tango in Cyberspace, and Devil's Dictionary is a companion book. They're different, they're separate, they live independent lives, but they're companion books because some of the characters overlap. And that I literally had to write a nonfiction book about the future. I had to write a couple of fiction books about the future just so I could hold it in my head and say, okay, what happens when all these things come together? What does that world actually look like?
I'm excited about the yellow stretch vet, man. Being able to get one of those bad boys and go to sleep and just wake up.
That's one of the things that, people don't quite get yet, though you're starting to see it poke up at car shows, is like when you've got autonomous cars, they don't actually have to look like cars anymore. You don't have to be the first guy in the cockpit looking down the road. You can make some changes. So I did. And I also figured that like car culture and like hot rod culture, and especially in America, dudes wanting to work on cars and do cool shit with cars, it's not going away, even if we make them autonomous. I lived for a while in Chimayo, New Mexico, which is the lowrider capital of America. And it's like a dirt poor farming community. And yet everybody's got like $100,000 work of art in their driveway they've been working on for 40 years. And it's amazing.
What do you think we're closest to getting right now? Is it, I know Uber Fly, I'm very excited about that. The VR headsets, the glasses, do you think, what technology do you think we're closest to getting right
closest to? So answering that question, I think, well, COVID had a huge and still continues to have a huge amplification on all things healthcare and all things artificial intelligence. So to start answering that question, I go, well, okay, AI got massively amped up during COVID. So did certain like climate change solutions. Those were the two things that seems to have exploded the most during COVID. So I would start poking downstream from that. And I think you nailed it. VR has been waiting to break out. People can't, like, metaverse is like going to the world. It's like every third word you hear these days. It was like psychedelics 2 years ago, right? Or maybe the metaverse is the psychedelic of 2022. Either way, I think VR is really starting to arrive in force. And I think AI, underneath it, right behind it, is really going to push that forward. So I think, again, not a futurist, but I think that's how I would work the equation and think about it.
So Lion Zorn is an M tracker. What's the difference between an M tracker and empathic?
So one of the things the fact that we're the only hominid species on the planet is like a rare thing in history. As a general rule, for all of recorded history, there were a lot of different hominid species. So it's actually really easy to fracture a species, to like break off and start a new lineage. And that's not all tremendously hard. And so, we've been hearing more and more about empaths, and we know that each generation is more empathic than the last. For example, I'm Gen X. Millennials got the level of empathy that I got through adult development, whatever, in my 40s and my 50s, in their 20s and 30s. So this keeps happening. And I just wanted to know what happens if we push that forward. There's a flow reason for this that we can come back to in a minute. But let me answer your question first. Lion Zorn is sort of like an empath on steroids. He feels empathy for all people, of course, but his empathy extends across the line of species. So he feels full and complete empathy for plants, for animals, and ecosystems. That's what I like to call empathy for all. And his empathy isn't just individual, it's cultural. So he can sort of see how the emotion works in culture, which gives him an angle on how culture develops. And the way I sort of think about that is like, he gets employed by these various different shadowy mega corporations throughout the book as an M tracker. And it's because Malcolm Gladwell on The Tipping Point wrote about cool hunters, right? In the 90s, they were people who went out and could trend spot. This is like the empathic next level times 10 version of that. And it had a flow tie-in because in flow, right, the state of peak performance, optimal performance, where we feel our best, we perform our best, turns out of the shit that gets amplified, you get way more empathy, and it often stretches beyond species lines. And this increases what's known as, used to be called ecological awareness. Now we talk about it as nature relatedness across species empathy, and it's the ability to see, perceive, care about the natural world. And there's a, if we can't start to care about ecosystems and forests the way we feel about friends and family, there's a lot of people who don't think this, including myself, who don't think this challenge is solvable. So that the shift in Lion Zorn, my protagonist, is sort of the shift that was also needed in society, and he was a little ahead of that curve.
Yeah, I think I'm feeling more empathy now than I ever have, right? Like just more that I get in touch with myself and my environment, especially the outdoors. I find myself getting in tune with a lot of what's really going on out there, disconnecting from the tech, even though the tech is like advancing, exponentially. That's when I find it the most, is when I can disconnect and go out into the woods and just kind of be out there, right? When do you feel the most empathy?
Yeah, absolutely the same. Absolutely the same. In fact, I had a very funny conversation with Dr. Paul Zak, who's the world's leading expert on oxytocin, the so-called cuddle chemical, the trust chemical, the love hormone. And I always say that some of my best friends are trees. And I often wonder when I'm in forests, like I'm alone, but am I experiencing oxytocin? Because I feel like cross-species empathy, and I really I feel for trees, feel for plants. My wife and I run a dog sanctuary. That's a big part of this work. We do hospice care and special needs care for really sick dogs. We've done this for about 20 years. That kind of is the gateway drug. And all my time as an action sport athlete, often in the mountains, and so I asked Paul, it was like, do you think I'm getting oxytocin, which we get from other people when I'm in forest? And we haven't run that. He thinks yes. I think yes. We haven't run the experiments yet, but I think we're going to find out that the answer actually is yes. And then if you have cross-species empathy, you're getting way more oxytocin, which explains some stuff and it's interesting because oxytocin is incredibly good for us, right? Good for the immune system, good for the nervous system. And it's sort of a weird argument for increasing cross-species empathy, that it's really good. Not only do we know that going into nature lowers cortisol, increases serotonin, right? Which is why a 20-minute walk in the woods will outperform most kind of antidepressants on the market today. But with oxytocin, you're taking that even farther. And it's interesting if the gateway is feeling empathy for plants, animals, and ecosystems, and suddenly we're getting more beneficial neurochemistry along the way.
Absolutely, man. There's a good story about you, and I think it was one of your rescues, right? There was I can't remember the dog's name, right? But you had issues with him. He was a rescue, and it was something about you getting down on your stomach and that's when you were feeling the most empathy. I don't know if you remember that story, or I think it was one of your emails chains or something like that, that really helped you spark a deeper connection with empathy.
Yeah, it was we adopt very, very, very sick. If you're a three-legged, one-eyed Chihuahua with a terribly abusive past, bad temper, heart problems, and end-stage cancer, you're our guy. That's what we like to work with. And a lot of those dogs, especially when you're dealing with Chihuahuas, in an effort to make dogs smaller and smaller so people like Paris Hilton can get their cute little purse dogs, that's inbreeding. So for every one healthy purse dog you might get, you're going to get 7 partially brain damaged, immunocompromised animals. And so we had a lot of crazy dogs, to use the technical term. And Misha used to try to attack me every chance. He would hide. I'd be hiking back to my office at the end of the day, and he would hide and wait for me to try to bite my ankles. And end of the day, after a long day of work, and you're trying to downshift, and I know I got to go talk to my wife, and I'm going back into my family life, and getting bit and attacked along the way, I would start get mad and screaming at the dog. Turns out it was really bad for the dog because he's already super stressed out, and it turns out it's also really bad for my marriage. So that was not a particularly good option. And if I wasn't going to get divorced, I had to solve it, and I couldn't figure it out. And one day I was like, I grew up in a family where everybody flew off the handle every now and again, and nobody my brother was having a nutty, or I was having a nutty. Like they didn't start screaming at me and try to like, beat me up and kick me or yell at me. Like they tried to calm me down and they had my back sort of. And I was like, okay, you know what? I'm going to really put my money where my mouth is. If I think like animals are equal to humans and dogs are equal to humans, I'm going to start treating Misha as if this was my brother having a meltdown of some kind when he's trying to attack me. And it worked, and it worked fast. And the weird thing that happened was like after about 2 weeks, it wasn't just that Misha had stopped attacking me. It was that suddenly I could notice I was seeing all the perceptual blinders had fallen from my eyes, and I was noticing all these details in Misha's behavior, little minor stuff. My wife would sometimes talk about it. I always thought she was crazy or she was seeing shit that I wasn't there. I didn't know what was going on. So then I was like, oh my God, it was a cognitive bias, right? And this is, we know humans have this, which is one of the reasons why empathy is useful, because empathy extends our sphere of caring, and that actually allows us to notice details about other people or other species or whatever. And in Misha's case, suddenly I started to see when I would freak him out. Like long before I actually noticed he was getting scared. And if I could, at that moment, that, as you pointed out, drop down to his level and just start talking to him and be like, it's cool. We got this. We're fine. No harm. I'm just going to sort of move this way. You can stay there. That's your space. I got it. It really cleared up. And it's amazing. It's funny because Misha's still with us today, almost, a couple of decades later. And I walk into rooms and now other dogs bark at me, and he just sort of sits there and looks at them like, hey, how come you're barking? What's your problem?
That's awesome, man. That's such a great story, being able to connect like that. I think, we can do that definitely in our personal lives. I found just for me, just like if I get on that, not physically getting on my stomach, but trying to put myself in other people's shoes, I can connect with them on a whole different level. I'm just fascinated with because I don't expect Stephen Kotler, the guy who writes about flow and the title of Devil's Dictionary, to be about empathy, right? Empathy for all. Do you think you're throwing people off with that?
So if you've read Small Furry Prayer, my third book, which is about the relationship between humans and animals and the work my wife and I have done, no. If you haven't read Small Furry Prayer and you didn't notice the parts about empathy and ecological awareness in Art of Impossible. I mean, I've talked about this stuff in other books. I can see it, but I'm interested in peak performance, and peak performance, as far as I'm concerned, demands empathy. If I'm going to be a peak performing human being, empathy, as Rilke pointed out, the poet Rilke used to say, it's a superpower for humans, right? It allows us to get inside another's mind. And from an interesting perspective, so one of the easiest ways to expand empathy, besides getting into flow, where it happens automatically, is loving kindness meditation. And Tibetan loving kindness meditation works. I mean, on a sense, Tibetan loving kindness meditation and Christian prayer almost, when you pray for other people, it's almost the same as Tibetan loving kindness meditation. And this is what Richie Davidson has spent 20 years, 30 years looking at the University of Wisconsin, and how, this one form meditation increases empathy. And really oddly, what happens along with that increase in empathy, and maybe this is different for different people, and I don't want to say what works for me works for you, because personalities are different and genes are different and all that stuff. But in my experience working, and I've been meditating for 30 years at this point, using almost every different system imaginable. And I came to loving kindness very late, because I was like, what, are you kidding? I'm going to pray for this. No, but I kept reading about Richie's work, and it was so fast. I was like, okay, I'm going to try this. And what I have found is, besides the expansion of empathy, in terms of shaking loose old habits that are invisible, just automatic behavior, it's the coolest tool I've ever bumped into, because I'm like, oh my God, now I noticed all my bad habits. I don't necessarily know if I can fix them, but I can see them. And that's a start.
Ooh, yeah. The shadow, right? That's exactly the same thing for me. I can start seeing the things pop up, like triggers, right? I can see myself getting upset at my kids. and like trying to be uh, aware of that, and then like wondering like where is it at in my body that has that memory or trauma that is conditioned inside of me, that's playing that record, that's playing the play button on my reaction, like, and then going in meditation and trying to like take a deeper dive. I think what does that meditation look like? How do you do it?
Love and kindness meditation
Yeah.
is literally like, you start out, there's variations on the phraseology, but you start out praying for yourself. You put all your focus on your heart, instead of an external, like focus on your breath, it's focus on your heart. And you start off praying for yourself, but may I be well, meaning healthy. May I be happy. May I be peaceful. May I be loved. Run through that 2 or 3 times, really trying to feel it. And you can add visualizations in. And then you start with somebody you love, your mother, your best friend, somebody it's really easy to get. And you may they, may John be well, may Trey be well, and you pray for that person. And usually like 3 to 4 rounds of it. And then when you're done, you try to visualize all the love that you felt when you prayed for yourself flowing into this other person. Then you move it to an anonymous stranger, somebody like you bump into on the street, you see with a regular basis, you have they're neutral in your life. And then you move it to somebody you're having difficulties with. And finally you move it out to the world at large, or, and you could go, that's a 15-minute version that I just gave you, that you can go for hours with it.
Sure.
But and man, I thought it was so silly. Like when I first, I just couldn't get up next to it. And what I discovered, first of all, a lot of people have this experience. It was wildly emotional for the first like 2 weeks of doing it. Like stuff was like, I was like, oh my, the whole time I was like, really? No shit. Like I couldn't believe the amount of emotions, and it's meditation, so you got a little bit of distance. You're like, you're weeping like a 2-year-old, but that's interesting.
Do you find yourself like more like sensitive to things now? Like I know with my meditation, like my heart-centered meditation, like I'm becoming more aware of like being sensitive, or like I'm same thing, right? Like I'll be watching a movie, or I'll be watching a sentimental moment on something, and then all of a sudden I'm feeling like I'm gonna cry. Yeah, you know what I mean?
For me, the story I told earlier about Misha, the dog who kept trying to bite me, and like that was the moment sort of everything broke for me. And it was funny because I had, I'm trained as a journalist, and my early career as a journalist, and like that's an objective. You have a lot of distance from things, and I was really good at that. You could put me in the room with some pretty awful, difficult, crazy situations, and I could interview warlords and and things like that. And there were journalists who had real difficulties with some of those situations. I had that distance, and once that started to happen, once my wife and I opened Rancho de Chihuahua and we started doing the animal work, it was all gone. And it's not that I can't be objective anymore, but yeah, I'm a lot more sensitive. I'm much more careful media wise, what I watch, what puts like 98% of anything on television or in the movies. I'm not, you know what I mean? It feels like pollution at this point, and I won't let it near me.
Yeah. You're taking it in. It affects you. I've eliminated a lot of news media. Just basically, I just check the weather. Essentially, that's it. Really, some headlines that I can't avoid.
Yeah, Stuart Brand once said that science is the only news, and I've agreed with that for a long time. And I literally I get almost no news media other than there are basically a handful of people who call me and tell me when I need to pay attention. I read New Scientist every week. I mean, I read a bunch of other science journals, but New Scientist is a great popular science, and roundup of all the science news, and that's literally been my news source for almost a decade.
Wow, that's awesome. I love the work you're doing. Empathy. I have senior project next semester. I'm a senior in psych major, and we're doing an independent study, and I want to do empathy, like the the difference in holding your heart center while looking at a picture of someone, and seeing if there's a difference in not holding it, if that makes sense. The control will just be looking at a picture, and then someone actually holding their heart center and looking at a picture. And
Will you
seeing,
use any biometrics with it?
I mean, for this, probably not. I mean, it's going to be probably scale based. I haven't even looked at the research
Yeah,
yet.
I mean, the other reason I add, because there's so much wearable stuff that you can, Whoop will give you heart rate variability. There's just some cool wearables that I like. You could throw in and probably scale pretty easily. That's an interesting study.
That'd be awesome. You know what I mean? I can come up there with a senior project, like with all these biometrics, like looking professional, because we have to give a presentation in front of the entire faculty at the university, and then come in there like a real professional scientist. That'd be badass.
Apple Watch will get you a lot of data, or will get you a lot. Whoop is probably, the easiest, cheapest. There's a couple others. There's just, at this point, it's like, why not take advantage of it, right? Why not go take that extra level, be a badass? And it's interesting to start to see if there's any, what are the physiological correlations of empathy, and that sort of stuff is interesting.
Sure. I think there's a quote that you've said that really, I really resonate with. It's like the power of imagination to shape the future, and the power of fiction to expand the imagination. That is so important to me, because like when you're describing the scenes in this book, like, I mean, there's a lot of detail. So you got to go into that imagination state. How do you strengthen that for yourself?
Reading fiction. I mean, like, swear to God, like I can't believe people don't read novels. It's the most amazing, like, super smart people who are super interested in self-improvement, betterment, peak performance, all this stuff. They do all the things. They biohack like mad. And yet reading fiction is one of the most astounding cognitive biohacks ever. I always say nonfiction is great. It makes you smarter. It gives you facts. That's fantastic. But fiction, for exactly what you just said, it forces you to go live in somebody else's head in some other world for a couple hundred pages.
Yeah.
And there, you have no choice but to walk around in their moccasins. And fiction gives you perspective. It literally widens perceptive. You're taking different information. When you go from the novel into the real world, you notice sort of different things. Makes you culturally wiser. There's just so much benefit to reading fiction. And unless you're gonna like spend your entire life going to every country in the world doing nothing but like talking to people, figuring out how they live, you know what I mean? Here's a way to like tour the world and really get to know other perspectives other than your own. You know what I mean? Like, and like, I love what I do. I love the people I work with. And it's phenomenal, but I can get, blinders, you know what I mean? I live in Stevenage after a little while, and you got to kick yourself out of that crap for a ton of different reasons. And I love nonfiction, right? I love learning more stuff, but it doesn't do it as, emphatically as fiction. Maybe sometimes you don't get that. Sometimes people get it from reading, like, I love good thriller fiction, good mystery fiction, good spy fiction. I'm a fan of that stuff. But I also read the like old school, I'll pull out my Charles Dickens or my like whatever, or, love to sort of read that stuff as well. And science fiction is great, really well done science fiction where you have the characters and the like alternative universe to live in is great too. So yeah, I go on and on about the power of fiction. There's a ton more about it, but like, it just cracks me up that a part of me is sad because as a novelist, I think, oh my God, this art form may be diminishing and going away a little bit. The other part of me is like, man, I'll take any edge I can get. And if you don't want to read fiction and I'm going to get to read fiction, cool. You know what I mean? It's a competitive universe, and you're literally like ceding victory to me.
Well, yeah, because I just got done writing a paper and I had to read like 20 different journal articles. And then like going to your book, it was like a breath of fresh air. It was like I was immersed into the story. Like the level of detail, like I was describing, like is insane. Like the description of the end of man, this bar, right? Like this underground bar. Like, yeah, I mean, you're like, I don't know if you've ever been to a place like that before. Like, I don't know if you Googled it or whatever, but I'm curious about that. Like,
So
how did you get that detail?
it's an underground ice bar, right? It was
Yeah.
an underground ice bar, and they do exist. I have I was at not a mini one. I want to say Norway or Sweden, and it was in like some hotel, and we didn't really hang out in there because it was freezing and it had been freezing outside. And I was like, okay, this is really cool. But like, one, I'm an empathy for all guy, and I don't want to be handed an animal skin to wrap myself up in. No, thank you.
Sure.
You know, and I don't want a big fur coat. You know what I mean? And I was like, okay, it's a little, this is freaking cool. And I just, I took it farther. What does the ice bar of tomorrow look like?
I mean, just like the details, man, just like the level of detail. Cause like, how important is it, right? Like in your story,
So
right? Like
a couple of things on that. One, I love this universe. So I really wanted, I wrote both Last Tango and this book so that Hollywood folks would have an easy time wrapping their head around it, right? I wanted them to be able to see what I saw very much. And I thought that was, super important. Like Blade Runner, the first was one of the most influential. I saw it when it came out, and it never, it shaped how I saw how I thought for years, decades. So I wanted to be able to provide that level of detail. And I also like the thing about the Devil's Dictionary is you've noticed is some unbelievably crazy stuff happens along the way, right? Mm-hmm. And yet, if crazy stuff happens in a book, you can sort of kick your reader out of the book. You know what I mean? I always feel like if you're going to give me 6 or 7 hours to read any of my books, nonfiction or fiction, my job has to be not just to like communicate good ideas. I want you lost in my world. I want you can't put this book down. Oh my God, laughing. I want to make you laugh a lot, and I want to blow your mind a lot. I want to make you think a lot, and I want to make it fun. I want to make you smarter, but I want to make it fun because like there's a lot of choices out there. Right. There's tons of options for your attention. And if I'm sort of on it, you gave me 7 hours, that's amazing. This is what I'm going to try to give you back in return. And as a result, I had to do things like you couldn't make it, like you had to believe it. It's this crazy world. And so I kept asking myself, if I was in this situation, what would I do? What would I see? Where would I look? Like I didn't try to like reinvent the wheel and do all the fancy crap I tried to do when I was an earlier writer. I literally was just like, okay, Stephen, you've walked into the ice bar. You need to find somebody. You're looking around. What do you do? And I would like run the scenes in my head and sort of put myself through as a character. That I think the detail you're seeing is also because I sort of like, I know what the reader's going to be looking at because I put myself through this scenario, right? And I hopefully got all the details right from what you'd need to see without like belaboring you. There's fiction writers who'll give you like 77 pages of scene detail, and you're like, okay, I could have been good with 74 pages. 77, and it's overkill.
Oh man, yeah, I appreciate it because it like gives my brain something new to like envision, right? When you're just doing research and reading the literature, it's just like it's so like the stats, the data is just overwhelming, and then you're trying to see what their point is and what they're where they're going with it. But this just really allowed me to immerse myself into the entire storyline. How do you fill in, like, do you start out from point A to point B and just fill in the middle, or do you kind of just write as you go?
It's a great, so I have made every writer will make the critical error of writing as you go in fiction. And maybe some people could pull it off. What I learned is, dude, I never met a tangent I didn't love. You know what I mean? My first novel took 11 years. Why? Because I never met a tangent I didn't love. And Chekhov, the playwright, had this famous dictate about like, if you in a saloon, if a character comes in and they hang their gun on the wall and go to the poker table and sit down in scene one, right? Which you had to do. You checked your guns at the door, basically, in saloons. You hung them on pegs. He's like, it's got to be fired by Act 5, right? Otherwise, everything's not complete. And so if there's with tangents, like you're hanging guns on the wall, and you get to the end of the book and you're like, holy crap, I've got 1,000 things to resolve, or my reader's not going to be fulfilled. I didn't fulfill the promise of the book. And I learned that I made that mistake. So with this book, especially, because this book is over the top, I had a very clear outline of where my scene started and where it ended. I had freedom to go between, but I kept it very tight. And the term, if you knew me while I was writing Devil's Dictionary, Stephen, what are you thinking about? Plot discipline, man. I'm about plot discipline. That was everything for me, because I knew that, like, if I didn't, walk a really tight line, this, like, a lot of stuff happens in the book and you follow it and it works because I'm doing that. Like, you don't notice, right? You're just reading through, but it's literally the most technical book I've ever written because of plot discipline, because there's so much crazy, fantastic, cool stuff that happens to control it and make it believable and understandable. Took a lot. So in this particular case, because of the nature of the book, extreme, I started with A and I went to B, and I was very, very, very careful.
How long did it take you to come up with the plot, like that whole storyline? So the storyline, should we give the listeners a taste of what it is? Sure. Yes, absolutely.
So I gotta give people one environmental fact. So there's a term you may not be familiar with, which is mega-linkages. And this is an idea that came out of the foundations of conservation biology back in the early 70s, which is basically plants and animals need room to roam. Keystone predator is the most important apex predator in an ecosystem. So wolves, mountain lions, can have like 500-mile home ranges, and they need that to procreate. They need that, otherwise the entire ecosystem changes, which is why, wolves were reintroduced to Yosemite, and suddenly, deer populations dropped, other things rebounded, the aspen groves came back, moose could come, and it had this huge impact and made the ecosystem a lot healthier. So back in the 70s, there was this idea of mega-linkages. Let's take all our national parks, let's connect them by migration corridors, much thinner strips of wildland, and make them continent-wide. So there's something known as the Wildlands Project that was trying to build 5 continent-wide mega-linkages. The most famous is known as Yellowstone to Yukon, literally Yellowstone to Yukon. And this is ongoing. People are still working on this. This is not a crazy idea. E.O. Wilson wrote about it in Half Earth. The UN has adopted, they want to 30% of our oceans and 20% of our land mass. That's, the same. It's all this stuff has become sort of standard environmental thinking, right? So much like today, where we've got billionaires trying to compete, who can go into space first? Is it going to be Jeff Bezos, or is it going to be Elon, right? I figured 15 years from now, we're going to have billionaires competing to establish the world's first mega-linkages. And that's sort of like the background is you've got these two sort of warring billionaires trying to create the world's first mega-linkages in this world where we've sort of solved some of these grand environmental challenges. This is one of the ways it's happened. So you asked a question. I went on a mega-linkage tangent and I forgot your question. Your question was
the storyline, right? Like you have all that research, right?
So I had the idea of sort of these two conflicting, these mega-linkages and billionaires creating mega-linkages for a while. Like Last Tango in cyberspace starts off with Lion Zorn finding a human head mounted on the wall of a trophy hunter's wall. So he's got all animals, and then there's a human head. I had the idea of this human head mounted on a wall 30 years ago. I spent 30 years trying to figure out how the hell the head got on the wall, but it took 20 years. It took 20 years to figure out how the head got on the wall. I had the idea of these sort of competing mega-linkages for a while as well. And how did it come, how did it come together? Took that happened more or less when I was writing it. And some of it was like figuring out what the bad guy was going to do at the end of the book, right? I introduced there's a bad guy. I'm not going to give a ton away here, but like I had these, and that once I got that piece and where he was going to come out and all of this, that's when it snapped together. And then it was just a question of, you know, things that fit the world. So like there's the first, I think in literature, the first flying motorcycle chase scene, right? In literature is, I think, in this book. Now, a friend of mine, Dejra Molnar, is the inventor of the world's first flying motorcycle. So we have those. They've been around for about 20 years. They're not commercially available, but they're really coming. And so some stuff was sort of dictated by, okay, I want an action scene. I want a chase scene. In the future, what do you have at your disposal? How can we do this in a way that's going to be really, really cool?
Ooh, I like the scene. I'm like near the end of the book, but I love that scene just because of the idea, using my imagination to, you know, imagine that flying motorcycle, you know, lines on what he's doing in that scene and everything in between. But yeah, I love the technology aspect of it. Like just saying that, you know, 15 years out, this is where we could possibly be. But there's a lot of similarities in today, right? Like empathy for all. There's a lot of divide. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, this was something. I guess that, you know, Andrew Hessel, who's a synthetic biologist, is a good friend of mine. We've known each other since early days at Singularity University, and Andrew used to laugh at people's fears about Gattaca. He's like, as a geneticist, he's like, it is crazy that we would use all this tech to create this perfect single species. It looks like this. And he's like, humans are endlessly creative. Like, think about, like, if parents don't want robo children, they want the perfect version of themselves, right? He's like, that's the same thing that's going to happen with all these sort of other technologies going forward. So I forgot your question again. I went in Andrew Test.
You're good, man. You're good. So like there's obviously divides, right? Like there's
the divides.
Yeah.
So he got me thinking about this. I was like, oh wow, you're gonna have some of the, I was thinking early, before I was even talking about the divides in this book, I was thinking about what's gonna happen when, like, think about all the prejudices we have today and how easy it is to develop new prejudices in a sense. And what's going to happen when animals, like human animal hybrids, there's already underground movements to put cat's eyes into like goth culture. And it's going to come out of like punk culture or goth culture. It's not going to come out of some mainstream lab. It's going to come out of some like punk lab somewhere that is just like almost as a fashion statement, or humans with tails or things like that. Isn't there going to be a keep humans pure versus like there's going to be that backlash? And I started to think, well, if there's a whole group of people who start like empathizing with plants, animals, and ecosystems and seeing them having equal rights with humans, there's of course going to be a whole bunch of humans who are like, no, humans first. And so that I was like, okay, if we were to actually solve climate change, solve species die-off, make this shift into a society where, you know, I love plants, animals, and ecosystems as, you know, friends and family, there were going to be a bunch of people who hated me for loving plant. Like, I wish it wasn't the case.
Sure.
And like, we keep getting blindsided by our prejudices. You know what I mean? Like, and it keeps making a mess of things. And I was like, okay, fine. Let's get out ahead of this one. Let's see it coming. Let's start talking about this now, because if we don't solve climate change or species die-off, I don't think our species is going to really survive, not at the numbers we're at. And so if we're going to solve these things, then this is going to happen. And let's start talking about it now so we don't get blindsided in another 15 years by a whole nother set of prejudices that like we have to deal with, because the brain does us-them divides automatically. It's built in. And it's a survival mechanism, right? But as soon as the brain, first foundational question the brain asks is this thing like me or not like me? Whenever we encounter anything else that we think might be alive, the brain goes, is it like me? Because if it's like me, maybe I can befriend it or mate with it. right? And if it's not like me, maybe I better run away from it, or maybe I should chase it down and make it dinner, right? Like that's what the brain does at a foundational level. That's what it does every time we encounter other. That's why we have what psychologists talk about as our sphere of caring. It's everything inside that sphere is we, right? Everything outside that sphere is them. And some of us, you talk to the astronauts who have been, into space, they had the overview effect, and that sphere of caring extends to the entire Earth. So we know it can widen out, that possible. Or you get the most, misogynist, racist, close-minded, take your pick, who lives in a very tiny, small bubble of hate as the opposite end. And so I don't know. I just wanted to see it coming and head it off at the pass if I could.
We should give that group the psychedelic evolution and see what happens. That is crazy. You talk about the psychedelic evolution. I don't know if it exists, but it's trippy, dude. Can you talk about that?
So how do you expand a sphere of caring and widen cross-species empathy? It happens automatically in flow, but it's not actually in a lot of altered states of consciousness, including psychedelic states. So there's a tremendous amount of research that shows that if you have psychedelic experiences, especially while outside in nature, they will expand nature relatedness. Robert Card Harris's lab, we've done some work with him at Imperial College in London, who's done almost all the brain imaging on psychedelics, just published a great paper on this. And the reason this matters is when nature relatedness expands, our ecological awareness expands, the next thing that follows is environmental activism. It's a very smooth transition. Some of it actually has to do with oxytocin, because oxytocin tends to lead to behavioral change. So once you're producing oxytocin in the natural world, you get activism on the downside of that. So psychedelics produce this stuff. And so I started thinking about future psychedelics. And the first level was in Last Tango, the companion book. I gave you a psychedelic that expanded cross-species empathy. So the whole planet could sort of have the same mind shift that Lion Zorn and Empathy Tracker had experienced, right? And that was a way of shifting the mindset of society very, very quickly to solve climate change issues. But one of the things that, I don't know if you noticed this about like drug culture, but like every 10 years we get like whole new levels of psychedelics that are much wilder than what came before. And like you go back to the 60s, nobody wanted to mess around with DMT. It was scary. It was really hardcore. Acid, mushrooms, those might be okay, but DMT. And today, like DMT is all over the place in culture. It's really spread through subculture and starting to sort of trickle into the mainstream even a little bit, in ways, unexpected ways. And I was like, that's a wildly different sort of psychedelic than anything that's come before. And I just figured that trend continues. So if this first drug expands empathy, what's going to be better than that? What's going to be the wilder trip than that? What's going to push this farther? And I came up with a psychedelic called Evolution, where you literally trip evolution. So you evolve through the eras, and there are different lineages, different phylums of animals, and there's chordata and whatnot, vertebrates, and I thought about it that way. And I've met underground chemists along the way when I was researching stealing fire and things like that, who are working on some very wild psychedelics. And I will tell you that like the really strange stuff and is stuff coming out of like animal shaman culture, like underground shamanic chemists who are really interested in, so like, I don't know what they're going to produce. I don't know what's real. I've never tried any of these substances, but I've talked to the people who are sort of doing the work. And I know like the stuff that I'm talking about is stuff they are fantasizing about. And I also know what's happening in chemistry. We're getting like a 3D chem printer that I wrote about in, it was in Faster, it was in Stealing Fire as well. This is already being built in Scotland. Like this is a 3D chem printer can print molecules from scratch. Wow. And you add an AI interface to it that, gives you voice recognition for drug discovery. And again, this is real. This is a technology that already exists, was used for COVID, voice recognition AI, where you tell the AI, okay, I want a drug that, has this and low side effects here and blah, blah, blah. And it can start creating it from scratch, and you start putting these things together and you're like, oh, wow, we're about to like completely empower psychedelic chemists. Maybe this is a good thing. Maybe this is a bad thing, but like the idea that they could start create, I mean, they're already cocktailing these weird things, and suddenly we're arming them with nuclear level tools. It's going to be interesting.
No doubt. Devil's Dictionary. Can you see this as a movie?
For sure. I think it's a TV show. I think it's a series, because the worlds are so complete. But yeah, it's funny because as I said, Last Tango and Devil's Dictionary, they're standalone, but there's a book that sits between them. There's a book that's after Devil's Dictionary. There's a prequel. I like it. If I want to turn it into like a 10-part series, I could, because there's just questions in the story that are still in my head, like, oh, what would happen here? Or what would happen here?
No doubt. But
pardon me, what is the Devil's
I was
Dictionary?
going to say Devil's Dictionary for the guys that don't know.
So, two things. The Devil's Dictionary is a very much older book. There's another book called The Devil's Dictionary that I'm playing on, a little bit, written by a Civil War journalist named Ambrose Bierce, and his was like a satirical dictionary that really sort of pointed at sociocultural issues of the day. So that's not what my Devil's Dictionary is, but you can understand, the metaphor there. But in my book, one of the largest drivers of species extinction is exotic species. And so in the Devil's Dictionary, in this version, it's an AI with a voice recognition interface that it works like CRISPR on steroids and can write DNA of new animals. Now, this is, again, Andrew Hessel, I mentioned earlier, is a friend of mine. He's the charge of the Human Genome Write Project. We heard about the Human Genome Project, right? Sequence the genome, read it. Now they're trying to write a human genome from scratch. That's creating life from scratch. We're already doing this, right? We're doing it at the microbial level, at the level of viruses. Craig Venter famously did some of this work when he created the minimal viable genome for life. And that's something I wrote about, I want to say in bold, maybe in abundance. So this work is ongoing, and I just sort of pushed it forward and said, what happens if you have a computer that could create exotic life from scratch? And since exotics are the largest driver of extinction, you would have just extinction run amok. Thus, this would be the true Devil's Dictionary.
You'd get flying snakes.
Flying tree snakes.
Yeah. Fuck that.
Well, you have flying tree snakes now. What you'd get is hyper aggressive, deadly, poisonous flying tree snakes, which you don't have now.
Devil's Dictionary, Stephen Kotler. How can people get this book?
All major, but it's out. So Amazon's your friend here. Indie bookstores are super your friend. Go patronize your indie bookstores if you can. Let's keep them around. Barnes and Noble. You can get it anywhere.
I love it. Stephen Cotty, thank you for joining the show, my man.
Very my pleasure. Thank you for having me. So glad you liked the book. It was fun chatting with you about it.